There is something nobody tells you about the retirement number. Not the advisors, not the articles, not the people who have already crossed over. Something that sits underneath all the responsible math, underneath the spreadsheets, the scenarios, the quarterly updates, and only becomes visible after it's too late to change what it cost you. I stayed 3 years past the point where the numbers said I could go. 3 years. And I told myself every single one of those years that I was being careful, that I was being smart, that I was doing exactly what a responsible person does. I believed it. The math agreed with me. What the math couldn't see, what I couldn't see, was what those 3 years were actually for. And it wasn't until I was sitting in my garage in retirement, looking at a wobbling pine shelf I'd just built badly and didn't care, that I understood what I'd been using the number to avoid. My name is Gary Mercer. I'm 59 years old. I retired 6 years ago after 29 years in operations management, and I've spent most of those 6 years reckoning honestly with what the careful math actually cost. That's what this channel is for. If this is a conversation you've needed to have, subscribing is your way of keeping it going. I'd be grateful for that. And when this video is done, if something landed differently than you expected, write it in the comments. Tell me what you understood today that you hadn't seen quite that way before. I read every one. What I'm about to share took me 2 years in retirement to see clearly, but once I saw it, I couldn't look at those 3 years the same way again. How many years did you give it for the number, the safe number, the one you had written down somewhere, in a spreadsheet, in the back of your mind, on a notepad in the drawer of your desk that you'd look at sometimes when the quarter was bad and you needed to remember why you were still there? How many years did you work past the point where part of you already knew you could stop because the number said, not yet? I want you to sit with that question for a moment before I say anything else. Because I did the math on that once. The real math. Not the financial math. That math I'd done 100 times. I mean the other math, the one that counts what those years actually cost. And I've never put it in a video. Until today. It was a Thursday afternoon, April. I was 53 years old and I was sitting in my car in the parking garage at the office. And I had just been offered a separation package. Voluntary. The kind of offer that, if you run the numbers, makes complete sense to take. And I knew it made sense. I'd known it for about 6 months before that Thursday, maybe longer, and I sat in that parking garage for 45 minutes before I drove home and told Carol they'd offered it to me. She already knew I was going to take it. She'd been waiting for me to figure that out for 2 years. What I did not tell her, what I did not tell anyone, including myself for quite a while, was that I'd known I could leave for longer than I admitted. The number had been there, not perfect, close enough. And I stayed anyway, not because the math demanded it, because I needed the math to keep demanding it. There is a difference. It took me the better part of 2 years in retirement to understand what that difference was. This video is about that difference. How many of you have a number? Not the number you tell people at dinner parties when the conversation turns to retirement. The real one. The one you check against your accounts on a Sunday morning when nobody's watching. The one that has been, for years now, the quiet answer to a question you haven't fully asked yourself yet. How many of you have looked at that number and thought, almost there, and felt something that you called responsible, but that might have been something else entirely? How many of you have stayed one more year because the math said stay, and then another year, same reason, and then a third, and somewhere in that third year, something in you went quiet in a way you didn't completely investigate? I'm not asking to make you feel bad. I'm asking because I was that person. I was precise about it. I had a spreadsheet. I updated it quarterly. I knew to the month based on 3 different scenarios, conservative, moderate, and what I privately called realistic, when the number would be solid enough to leave. I ran those numbers the way I ran operations, methodically, without sentimentality, with a margin built in for the things you can't predict. The math was good. I still believe the math was good. What the math couldn't tell me was what I was using it for. Here is the surprising thing about a retirement number. And I say this as someone who is not a financial advisor and is not giving you financial advice. I say this purely as someone who lived it. The number is real and the number matters. But the number has a second function that nobody talks about. The number is also a reason not to decide. As long as the number isn't hit, you don't have to answer the question of who you are without the job. The math gives you permission to defer that question indefinitely. And that deferral feels responsible. It feels like planning. It feels like the kind of thing a careful person does. I was a careful person. I deferred that question for 3 years past the point where the answer was available to me. What I'm about to share took me 2 years in retirement to understand. And once I saw it, I couldn't look at those 3 years the same way again. Not with bitterness, but with a kind of honest reckoning that I think you deserve to hear from someone who has been through it. Because nobody told me this when I was sitting in that parking garage, and I wish someone had. There is a man I have lunch with every 2 weeks. His name is Dave. We worked together for 11 years. He was in procurement, I was in operations, and we had the kind of working friendship that gets built over a decade of solving problems in adjacent departments. Dave retired at 57. I know this because I watched him leave, and I was 50 years old at the time, and I remember thinking, too early. I remember thinking he was leaving money on the table, leaving certainty on the table, jumping before the numbers were fully solid. I was wrong about that. But what I want to tell you isn't that I was wrong. I want to tell you what it was like to watch Dave from the inside of those 3 extra years I worked after I could have left. The first year after Dave retired, I didn't see him much. We had lunch once, maybe twice. He seemed fine. More than fine, honestly, which bothered me a little in a way I didn't examine. I was still in the office, still managing the floor, still running the quarterly reviews, and Dave was, I don't know, doing whatever Dave was doing. He'd mentioned something about a woodworking project. A canoe, I think. I remember thinking, a canoe, as if that were an adequate replacement for a career. The second year, I ran into his wife at the grocery store. She said Dave was great. She said it the way people say it when they mean it. And I nodded and said that was good to hear, and I drove home and I sat in the driveway for a few minutes before going inside. By the third year, I watched Dave from a distance. I had what I can only describe as a low-grade chronic discomfort about him. Not envy exactly, something more unsettled than that. Because Dave had done what I kept telling myself wasn't quite ready yet. Dave had looked at the numbers, decided they were good enough, and stepped off. And from everything I could observe, Dave was not falling apart. Dave was not adrift. Dave had made a canoe, for God's sake, and he seemed genuinely happy with that information. I started to understand something, slowly and against my will. The number was not the reason I was still there. The number was good. The number had been good for a while. What kept me was the question on the other side of the number, the one the spreadsheet couldn't answer. Because as long as I was VP of operations at a 600-person manufacturing company, I knew exactly what I was for. I knew who needed me and why and on what schedule. I was the person who fixed things. That was not a job description, that was a self-description, and I had no idea, not the faintest outline of an idea, who I was going to be when nobody needed me to fix anything anymore. The number was not protecting my retirement. The number was protecting me from having to find out. That is the thing I wish someone had told me at 52. Not the specific dollar amount, not a withdrawal strategy. I mean this particular human truth, that the number can become a very sophisticated form of avoidance. That staying one more year because the math says stay, and staying one more year because you're afraid of what's on the other side of leaving, can look exactly identical from the outside. Even from the inside if you're not paying attention. Dave and I talk about this now sometimes on the second lunch of the month when the conversation goes long. He told me once that he'd been scared too, that he'd had the same question I had. What am I for when the job is gone? And that the difference was he'd decided to go find out instead of waiting for the math to tell him it was safe. He said something I've thought about a lot since. He said, the math will never tell you it's safe. It'll just keep letting you think you need more of it. I think about those 3 years with some regularity. Not with grief exactly. More the way you look at an old receipt for something you didn't need. You made the purchase. The money's spent. What do you do with that information? What I've done is this. I've tried to understand what those 3 years actually contained. Not in terms of what I accumulated, but in terms of what I spent. I spent 3 years sleeping badly because the stress that had been building for a decade did not pause for my spreadsheet. I spent 3 years coming home to Carol as a man who was, as she once put it with characteristic precision, present in the house and absent from the marriage. I spent 3 years telling myself I would start the woodworking shop when things settled down, when the quarter was better, when the transition at work was complete. There was always a transition at work. There is always a transition at work. I know that now in a way I did not know it then. I have a neighbor named Carl. He is 71 years old. We walk some mornings, not every morning, but 2 or 3 times a week, depending on the weather and how his body is cooperating with him. Carl retired at 62 from 30 years in engineering, and he has Parkinson's now, which arrived at 68 and has been, in his words, a full-time project ever since. Carl is not someone who complains. He is among the least sentimental men I have ever known. But there is something in the way he walks, something in the pace he keeps and the way he sometimes stops to look at nothing in particular for a moment that carries a specific kind of knowledge. We don't talk about it directly. We're not that kind of friends. But one morning this past October, we were about 2 miles into the walk, and Carl stopped and looked at a yard we pass every time. Just a yard, a maple tree going red, somebody's golden retriever sleeping on the porch. And he said, "I keep meaning to get a dog." And I said, "You should get a dog." And he said, "I know." And we kept walking. I have thought about that exchange more times than makes sense for something so small. Because I know what Carl meant, and I think Carl knows I know. There is a particular kind of quiet that happens between 2 men when they both understand that something is not a conversation about a dog. He had more years of good walking ahead of him than he knew when he was 62 and still calculating. And I don't say that to be dark. I say it because Carl would say it himself, and because the thing Carl's walk taught me is the thing I keep coming back to whenever I'm tempted to romanticize the responsible math. The math doesn't know about the dog you keep meaning to get. In my 2nd year of retirement, I built a shelf. This is not a metaphor. I actually built a shelf. It was the first thing I made in the woodworking shop I'd been promising myself since I was 40 years old, and it was objectively terrible. The angles were off. It wobbled if you looked at it wrong. It was the kind of shelf that if someone brought it to me in operations, I would have sent it back to the floor for rework without a second thought. I kept it. It is still in my garage. Carol has offered to replace it several times with something functional. I have told her no each time, because that shelf is the first thing I built after I stopped building things for a reason. No metrics, no deadline, no one waiting on the output. I built it slowly and badly, and I built it alone on a Saturday morning in October of my first retirement year. And when I was done, I stood there looking at this wobbling, imprecise, structurally questionable piece of pine, and I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Not pride, exactly. Closer to relief. That shelf took me about 4 hours to build. It probably should have taken 2, but I kept stopping to look out the garage door at the backyard. Just looking. At nothing. At the yard and the sky and the neighbor's fence and the particular light that comes in on an October morning in Ohio when the leaves are almost done. I hadn't stood in a garage and looked at a backyard for a long time. I'd forgotten that was something a person could do on a Saturday. I tell you this because the shelf is not the point. The shelf is made of pine, and it wobbles. The point is the Saturday. The point is the October morning. The point is the 13 years between the day I first thought about a woodworking shop and the day I actually built the first thing in one. And when I do the math on those 13 years, the other math, the one I promised you at the start, what I find is not a number that makes me comfortable. The years between wanting something and having the time to want it honestly are not recoverable. That is not a tragedy, that is just true. And I think it deserves to be said plainly without softening it into a lesson about making the most of what you have. I believe in making the most of what you have. I am, by most measures, doing that. But there is a difference between making the most of what you have and pretending that what you gave up cost nothing. The safe math cost me something. It cost Carl something. It cost most of the people I know who stayed past the point where the question was available to them, because the math gave them permission to wait, and they took it. Some of those people are fine. Most of those people are fine. And all of them, when you get them honest enough, in a long lunch or on a morning walk, or in the comments of a video that says the thing they haven't heard anyone else say out loud, will tell you about the 3 years, or the 2 years, or the 5 years, when the number kept moving and they kept following it. And somewhere in there, the thing they were waiting to do kept waiting. I want to say something now, and I want to say it as directly as I know how. The safe math was real. I am not telling you the number was wrong. I'm not telling you to ignore it, or that it doesn't matter, or that you should leave before you're ready. That is not mine to say, and I am not saying it. What I am saying is something different, and I want you to hear it clearly. The math will always give you a reason to wait. That is what the math does. It is very good at reasons. It can always find one more variable to optimize, one more scenario to run, one more quarter to hold through. The math is excellent at its job. The math's job is to tell you when you are financially ready, and it does that well. What the math cannot do, what no spreadsheet I have ever seen can calculate, is the cost of waiting for the math to be done. What those years contain, what you spend them on, what you are not doing while you are doing the math. That is the calculation nobody showed me. I did the numbers. I ran them carefully. I ran them the way I ran every operation I was ever responsible for, without sentimentality, with margin built in. And the numbers were right. They were right, and I stayed anyway. I stayed because the number was close but not perfect. I stayed because there was a transition at work. I stayed because it was easier to follow the math than to answer the question of what I was going to be when the math finally said I was allowed to stop. And I want you to stop for a second, just stop, because I suspect some of you know exactly what I am talking about. Not as an abstract thing, as a Tuesday morning, as a Sunday night when you're already dreading Monday and you think, one more year. As a conversation with your spouse that you keep not quite having. As a number that keeps moving just slightly beyond where you are, not because the math demands it, but because the number is the last thing standing between you and a question you are not sure how to answer. I am 6 years into my retirement. 6 years. I still don't have it all figured out. I have the shelf. I have the morning walks. I have lunch with Dave every 2 weeks. I have Carol, who is right about all of it, and who has been gracious enough not to make a significant point of that. I have a life that is, by any honest measure, a good one, and I still think about those 3 years. Not every day, but often enough to sit down and make this video. Often enough to want to say to the person who is 52 or 55 or 58 and running the numbers again, the math will always give you a reason. The question is what you're using the math to avoid. Here is what I want you to do. Not someday, this week, before next Monday. I want you to take 20 minutes. No phone, no spreadsheet, no calculator. Just paper, or a quiet room, or a walk by yourself. And I want you to answer one question honestly. Not the number question, not the withdrawal question. This question. If the number were already hit, if the math were done right now, today, what would you actually do on a Tuesday? Not what you think you should want to do, what you actually want to do. The first thing that comes to you, the wobbling pine shelf of it, the canoe of it, because that answer, that specific, possibly embarrassing, probably ordinary answer, is the retirement you are actually working toward. And I think it is worth knowing what it is before you get there. I think it is worth asking whether the math is in service of that answer, or whether the math has become a way of not having to name it yet. That is the challenge. Not a financial one, a human one. Write me something in the comments. Tell me whether you're going to take those 20 minutes. Tell me whether you've already taken them and what came up when you did. Tell me how many years you gave the number, or how many you're planning to give it, and whether somewhere underneath that number there is a Tuesday morning you haven't let yourself imagine yet. I read every comment on this channel, not because I have to, because the people who show up here tend to say things that are worth reading. And I suspect what you have to say about this particular question is more honest than most things you'll say this week. If this video names something you've been carrying around, something you felt but hadn't quite heard put this way before, I'd be grateful if you subscribed. The bell, too, if you want it. But more than the subscription, I'd ask you to share this with one person. One specific person you know who is in the middle of the math right now, who is somewhere in those one more years, who might benefit from hearing someone say plainly, the math is real, and the math matters, and the math is not the whole story. That person might need 20 minutes and a question more than they need another scenario in a spreadsheet. 6 years in, sitting in a garage in Columbus with a wobbling pine shelf 10 feet behind me. That's what I believe. I don't know if it applies to you, but I think you probably know whether it does. Take care of yourselves out there.